The king was dead before the sun fully rose. No battle. No warning. Just silence, where a heartbeat used to be, and a throne suddenly cold. But it wasn't the death that shook the palace to its stone bones. It was what he said before he died. The royal physician hadn't even closed the king's eyes yet when he turned to his daughter Tsisana, the only child bold enough to be in that room. Her father reached for her wrist with a grip that had no business being that strong in a dying man. "Tsisana," he rasped, his voice like gravel dragged across iron, "you will wed Archil of the house Eristavi before the next full moon." The room went so quiet she could hear the candle flames trembling. "He is our enemy," she said, each word careful, each word controlled. "His family took our eastern lands. His father killed yours before you killed him. I would sooner." "You will do it," the king cut her off, his eyes locking on hers with something that looked less like a father's love and more like a king's command. "Because if you don't, what I know about how our bloodline truly began, Archil already knows it too, and he will use it to burn everything, every title, every alliance, every crown we wear." He released her wrist, and then he was gone. Tsisana stood over her father's body in a room full of weeping servants and felt nothing but cold fury rising up her spine. She didn't know yet what secret her father was protecting. She didn't know yet what Archil of Eristavi actually wanted from this marriage. But she was about to find out. And trust me, neither of them was ready for what fate had already decided.
Before we continue, let me know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comment section and let me know where my kings and queens are coming from. Please, if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe because it will help me to grow and encourage me to make more videos. As you're watching, don't forget to say what you love about the video and what you don't love about the video. It will help me to do better and satisfy you next time. Please subscribe. Let's continue.
The palace of Mtsketa had always felt like a place that swallowed people whole. Its corridors were long and carved from pale stone that never warmed, no matter how many torches lined the walls. The ceilings reached up like they were trying to escape the rooms below them, and the floors were so polished you could see your own face, looking back at you pale, tired, questioning why you were still standing. Tsisana had grown up here. She knew every shadow in every hallway. She knew which steps creaked before dawn and which doors needed lifting before they opened. But that morning, for the first time in her 22 years, the palace felt like a cage she hadn't noticed being locked inside. She stood at the window of her father's chamber, her father's former chamber, and watched the courtyard below fill with people who had no idea what she was carrying. Guards crossed the stone floor in formation. Servants moved quickly with their heads down. 2 noblewomen from the western province stood near the fountain, talking in low tones, their hands moving the way people's hands move when the news is too large for words alone. Everyone was grieving. Everyone was performing grief. Tsisana was doing neither. She was thinking. Her father had just died, and his last act was not to bless her, not to say her name with softness, not to leave her with something she could hold. His last act was to chain her to the one name in the entire kingdom that made her blood go hot with hatred, Archil Eristavi, the heir of the house that had taken 2 of their eastern provinces through bloodless manipulation and one very bloody ambush 12 years ago. The man whose family crest still appeared in her nightmares alongside the image of soldiers dragging farmers from their land. She had been 10 years old the first time she heard his name. She had hated it before she ever saw the face attached to it. And now she was supposed to marry him. She turned from the window when she heard the door open. It was Nino, her attendant, small, sharp-eyed, and one of the few people in the palace Tsisana actually trusted. Nino had been with her since childhood. She didn't bow the way the others did, all stiff and formal. She just walked in and stood close, the way someone does when they already know the news is bad and they're not pretending otherwise. "They're here," Nino said. "The Eristavi party. They rode through the eastern gate an hour ago. 40 men. Tsisana said nothing. 40 men is not a condolence visit, Nino continued. 40 men is a statement. My father sent for them, Tsisana said, before he died. He must have sent word weeks ago. She said it quietly, but what she felt was not quiet. What she felt was the specific kind of anger that comes when you realize someone you loved had been planning something behind your back for a very long time. Her father had not made this decision on his deathbed. He had been carrying it. He had looked at her across dinner tables and council meetings and family evenings, knowing what was coming, and said nothing. That was its own kind of betrayal. The council is gathering in the throne room, Nino said. They're asking for you. Tsisana moved to the bronze mirror near the chamber wall. She looked at herself the way she always did, before walking into rooms that required her to be more than she felt, shoulders back, chin level, eyes forward. Her hair was dark and loose, which was wrong for a formal appearance, so she reached for the pins on the table and began to work. Her hands were steady. She had learned young that your hands had to be steady when your chest wasn't. She wore deep green, which was the colour of her house. She wore no jewellery except the single band of gold on her right wrist that had belonged to her mother. She did not look like a woman in mourning. She looked like a woman preparing for war, which was, she thought, more honest. The walk to the throne room took her through the main corridor of the palace, past the painted ceilings and the tall arched windows that let in cold morning light. Courtiers stepped aside as she passed. She noticed the way they looked at her, not with grief, but with something closer to hunger. Everyone in a palace knows when power has shifted. Everyone watches to see who moves fastest to fill the space. Tsisana kept walking. She heard the throne room before she entered it, the low noise of too many voices in a large space, cutting off the moment the doors opened and people realized she had arrived. The room was full, her father's council along one side, advisers and noblemen filling the floor, and across the room, standing with a stillness that somehow occupied more space than all the movement around them, the Eristavi party. She saw Archil immediately. She would have known him even without the crest on his chest or the men flanking him. There was something about the way he stood, like the room had been arranged for him, like he had already decided how everything was going to go. He was taller than she expected, dark-haired, with a jaw that looked like it had been set against something for a very long time. His eyes found her the moment she walked in and stayed there, unmoving, giving nothing away. She matched it. She gave him nothing either. Lord Daviti, the head of her father's council, stepped forward with the particular energy of a man, grateful to have someone else in the room to direct things toward. He was old and careful, and had spent 30 years finding ways to say difficult things without quite saying them. Princess Tsisana, he began, we welcome the House of Eristavi on this sorrowful morning. Your father's wish, as conveyed to us and confirmed by Lord Archil's arrival, was that a formal union between your two houses be established without delay. In the interest of the kingdom's stability during this period of... I know what my father's wish was, Tsisana said, her voice carried without effort. It was a room built for carrying voices, and she had grown up using it. I was there when he expressed it. A ripple moved through the room. Lord Daviti nodded slowly. The way people do when they're grateful the difficult part has been said by someone else. Archil hadn't moved, hadn't looked away, and now he spoke for the first time, his voice low and even, like someone who never needed to raise it. Then we don't need a long ceremony, he said. Just an agreement. Tsisana looked at him directly. You'll find, she said, that nothing about this will be simple. The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. It was something harder than that, and she couldn't tell yet if it was contempt or recognition. Either way, it settled in her chest like a stone dropped in still water. The council began to talk around them. Papers were produced. Men leaned toward each other in the way men do when they're negotiating the details of something that will affect other people's entire lives. But Tsisana wasn't listening to them. She was watching Archil, and Archil was watching her. And somewhere in that silence between enemies, something else was already beginning. Something neither of them had agreed to, and neither of them could name yet. But it was there, and it wasn't going anywhere. The agreement took 2 hours to reach, and felt like 2 years. Tsisana sat at the long council table with her father's men on one side and Archil's on the other, and she watched the way a kingdom got traded in careful language and calm voices. Land boundaries were discussed. Titles were confirmed. The timeline of the union was set 30 days, which was just enough time to be called reasonable, and just short enough to feel like a trap. Through all of it, Archil sat across from her with his hands flat on the table and his face giving nothing, and Tsisana matched him with everything she had. When it was done and the council began to disperse, Lord Daviti approached her with the particular expression of a man who thought he was delivering relief. "Your father would be pleased," he said. Tsisana looked at him for a moment without responding and then walked away, because there was nothing she could say to that which would have been appropriate for a throne room. She moved through the corridor fast, needing air and space and the feeling of walls that weren't watching her. She took the side passage that led to the eastern garden, a narrow courtyard tucked behind the old wing of the palace, the kind of place that didn't appear on formal maps and wasn't used for anything official. She had been going there since she was a child, whenever the palace felt too large and too full of other people's expectations. She pushed open the low wooden door and stepped into the cold morning. She had been there perhaps 3 minutes when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. Archil stood in the doorway, one hand resting against the frame, looking at her with that same unreadable expression he'd worn in the throne room. She hadn't heard him follow her. She didn't know how he'd known about this passage. "This garden is not part of the formal tour," she said. "I wasn't looking for a tour," he said. He stepped inside and let the door close behind him, and she was immediately aware that they were now alone for the first time, without council members or advisers or the buffer of ceremony between them. He looked different without the room around him. Not smaller, he didn't become smaller, but more present somehow, more real. "You followed me," she said. "I walked in the same direction as you." He looked around the courtyard briefly, taking in the bare winter trees and the cracked stone fountain that hadn't run with water in years. "I wanted to speak without an audience." "Then speak." He looked at her. "I didn't come here for land or politics. I want you to know that from the start." She studied him. "Then why did you come?" "Because your father sent word that there was something threatening both our houses, something that could end both bloodlines if it came out the wrong way. He didn't give me details. He gave me a condition." Archil paused. The marriage was the condition. The cold in the garden pressed closer. Tsisana kept her breathing even. "My father told me you already knew the secret, that you would use it against us if I refused." Something shifted in Archil's face. "I don't know any secret," he said. "I know there is one. I know your father believed it was dangerous enough to offer me a marriage alliance with a house mine has been in conflict with for over a decade. That's all I know." She looked at him for a long time, turning the words over, checking them for angles. He wasn't performing. She was good at reading performance. The palace had trained her for it, and what she was seeing in his face wasn't the polished control of someone managing a lie. It was something closer to the truth, which in its own way was more unsettling. "If neither of us knows the full secret," she said slowly, "then we're both walking into something blind." "Yes," he said, simply, without apology. "That doesn't concern you?" "It concerns me enormously," he said, "which is why I'd rather we weren't enemies while we figure it out." She turned away from him, looking at the bare branches of the tree nearest the fountain. She had grown up being told that the Eristavi name meant greed dressed in gold. Her father had said it. Her tutors had said it. She had watched the eastern provinces struggle under policies that came from Archil's family's influence, and she had built her understanding of who he was from all of that, brick by careful brick. And now he was standing in her private garden telling her he didn't know the secret he was supposed to be holding over her head. Either he was the best liar in the kingdom, or her father had told her just enough of the truth to make her compliant and not enough to make her dangerous. She turned back. "I'll agree to the 30 days, she said. "I'll agree to the public arrangement, but I will not be managed. I will not be kept outside of decisions that affect my house. If you know something, anything, you tell me." "Agreed," he said, without hesitation. "Same condition applies to you." She held out her hand, not the way women were expected to extend their hands in formal greetings, but palm flat, the way her father had always sealed quick agreements in private. Archil looked at it for just a moment, then pressed his palm flat against hers. The contact was brief and firm and entirely businesslike, and yet she felt it register somewhere below her ribs in a way she had no interest in examining. He left the way he came. She stayed in the garden longer than she needed to. The days that followed had their own particular rhythm. The palace was in mourning, which meant it was also in transition, which meant everything was moving and everyone was pretending to be still. Tsisana threw herself into the work of it meetings with the council, decisions about the burial ceremony, letters to provincial lords that needed to come from her now that her father was gone. She had been preparing for governance her whole life, but there was a difference between preparing and doing, and she felt the weight of it in her shoulders every night when she finally sat down. Archil's men occupied the guest wing on the north side. She would pass members of his household in the corridors, and they would nod with careful respect, and she would nod back, and both sides would keep moving. But she was watching. She noticed things. His men were disciplined, not the rigid, fearful discipline of soldiers who followed orders they didn't understand, but something more settled than that. They moved with purpose. They spoke to palace servants without the dismissiveness she had expected. One of his senior men spent an afternoon helping the palace steward untangle a supply logistics problem that had nothing to do with the Eristavi visit. She noted that. She didn't know yet what it meant. She crossed paths with Archil himself twice in those first 3 days. Once in the corridor outside the council archive, where they acknowledged each other and kept walking. Once at the evening meal, where the table was long enough that they sat at distance, but close enough that she caught him watching her twice across the candlelight. She didn't look away either time, neither did he. On the 4th day, Nino came to her with a quieter face than usual. She sat down across from Tsisana in the private sitting room and folded her hands in her lap, which was the thing she did when what she had to say required stillness first. "One of the palace archivists came to me this morning," Nino said. "He found something in your father's private records, documents that were filed under a seal Tsisana hadn't seen before. He won't show them to the council. He says they were marked for your eyes only." She paused. "But he also says Lord Archil's name appears in them, several times." Tsisana set down the document she'd been holding. "Where is he now?" "Waiting in the lower archive. He's frightened." "He should be," she said, and stood up. She moved through the palace fast, taking the back stairs that dropped into the lower levels, where the old records lived in long wooden shelves, and the air smelled like coal dust and history. The archivist was young, younger than she expected, and when he saw her, he pulled the documents from inside his coat with shaking hands. She took them. She stood in the low light of the archive and read, and the longer she read, the stiller she became. Because what was written in those pages didn't just threaten her house. It didn't just explain why her father had made her agree to this marriage. What it explained was something older and darker and more tangled than anything she had been prepared for, something that reached back 3 generations and touched the founding of her family's claim to the throne itself. And if Archil didn't know this yet, he needed to. Because once this reached the wrong hands, and in a palace like this, Everything reached the wrong hands. Eventually, neither of them would be safe. Not as enemies, not even as allies. Not unless they became something else entirely. She folded the documents and pressed them against her chest and stood in the cold archive, while the implications of what she'd just read arranged themselves around her like a new and terrible map of the world she thought she'd known. She had 30 days. And now she understood that 30 days was not very much time at all. She found Archil in the courtyard behind the north wing, where he had been training with one of his men since early morning. She knew because Nino had told her, and she had waited until the other man left before she crossed the yard with the documents pressed flat under her arm and her face arranged into something that looked more composed than she felt. He saw her coming. He lowered the practice sword and stood watching her approach, breathing steadily from the exertion, his dark hair pushed back from his face. He looked like a man who had been expecting something to arrive. He just didn't know yet what shape it would take. She stopped in front of him and held out the documents without preamble. He looked at her face first before he took them. Then he read. She watched him do it, watched the small movements in his jaw and the stillness that settled over him, the way it settles over a man when something he feared turns out to be worse than he imagined. He read slowly. He read everything. When he finished, he held the pages at his side and looked out across the courtyard at nothing in particular. "How long have these been in the archive?" he said. "Long enough that my father knew about them when I was still a child," she said. "Long enough that everything he built, every alliance, every land agreement, every treaty was built on top of this." Archil looked down at the pages again. What the documents contained was this. 3 generations ago, the woman who founded Tsisana's bloodline, the great queen whose portrait hung in the main hall and whose name appeared in every formal title Tsisana carried, had not come to power the way the histories said. She had not been the last surviving heir of the old dynasty. There had been another heir, a legitimate one, and that heir had been removed quietly, in the dark, in a way that left no public record and a great deal of private guilt. The removed heir's descendants had survived. They had taken a different name. They had built a different house. And the name they had taken, 3 generations later, was Eristavi. Archil was not just her enemy. He was, by blood older than either of their fathers, the rightful heir to the throne she was standing on. "You didn't know," she said. "It wasn't a question." "No," he said. The word came out quiet and flat, stripped of everything except the truth in it. "If this reaches the council before we control it," she said, "they won't deliberate. They won't hold a formal hearing. Half of them will move immediately to whoever they think benefits them most, and the other half will panic and do something that can't be undone. We have days, maybe less, before someone else finds what that archivist found." "Where is the archivist now?" "Nino has him in a safe room in the lower wing. He won't speak to anyone else. He came to me because he was frightened, and because my father had apparently told him once, years ago, that if he ever found something that felt too heavy to carry, he should bring it to me and no one else." She paused. "My father spent a great deal of time preparing for a disaster he never told me about." Archil handed the documents back. His hand was steady. She respected that. She felt her own hands were steady too, and she knew how much work that took. "What do you want to do?" he said. She had thought about nothing else since the archive. "We can't destroy them. There will be copies somewhere, or at minimum people who know enough fragments that destroying these only removes our ability to understand the full picture before others do. We need to get ahead of it. We need to make the union real enough and fast enough that when this comes out, and it will come out, we are already standing together on the same side of it." He was quiet for a moment. "You're saying the marriage isn't just an arrangement anymore?" "I'm saying the marriage needs to look like a choice," she said. "Not a panic, not a political transaction. If we walk into that ceremony looking like 2 houses pressed together by fear, people will start asking what we're afraid of. We need them asking different questions." He looked at her with something she hadn't seen in his face before, not the careful blankness of the throne room or the guarded honesty of the garden, but something closer to consideration, like he was seeing her more fully than he had before, and adjusting something internal to make room for it. "You've thought about this more than I have," he said. "I've had less time to recover from the shock," she said, which turns out to be useful. Something moved through his expression that was almost a smile, and then wasn't. "All right," he said. "We do it your way." She wanted to feel relieved. She didn't, because doing it her way required something she hadn't yet fully admitted to herself, that to make this look like a choice, she would have to spend real time with him, talk to him, be seen with him in ways that would read to the court as genuine. And the problem, the one she hadn't spoken aloud, was that the more she stood near Archil of Eristavi, the less she trusted herself to remain as detached as the situation required. That evening the palace held the first formal morning dinner, which was the court's way of beginning to move through grief toward governance. Long tables in the great hall, candles everywhere, the soft weight of collective sadness pressed into polished ceremony. Tsisana sat at the head table where her father had always sat, and felt the size of the chair and the size of what it meant. Archil sat 2 seats to her left, which was a positioning the council had arranged, and which she had approved, because it looked appropriate without being intimate. During the meal, Lord Sandro, the eldest of her father's councillors, a man whose loyalties Tsisana had never been entirely certain of, leaned across the table with the careful warmth of someone who had been rehearsing what he was about to say. "The Eastern lords are restless," he said. 3 of them sent riders this morning. They're asking about the succession structure, about who holds authority over the provincial agreements while the formal transition is incomplete. He paused. "Some of them are specifically asking about Lord Archil's presence here and what it signals." "Tell them it signals stability," Tsisana said. "They may want more than signals." "Then they'll have to be patient," she said pleasantly, "which is something Eastern lords have always found difficult, and which is not my problem to solve tonight." Lord Sandro smiled with his mouth and absorbed the response, and she knew from long practice that he wasn't satisfied and would be moving quietly through his own channels before morning. She filed that away and kept eating. Beside her, almost too low to carry across the table noise, Archil said, "Sandro." "I know," she said. "He's been corresponding with someone outside the province. One of my men saw a rider leave through the servants' gate 2 hours before the dinner started." She kept her face forward, her expression unchanged. "How does your man know where the rider was going?" "He followed him to the edge of the city." A pause. "He was heading north." North was where 3 of the larger rival houses maintained their main estates. North was also, she knew and he knew, the direction in which a secret about an illegitimate throne would cause the most damage if it arrived in the wrong ears. She set her cup down slowly. The evening had just changed shape entirely. She looked up and found Sandro watching her from across the table with a warmth that had nothing warm inside it, and she smiled back at him with everything she had learned from a lifetime in this palace, which was how to show a man exactly what he expected to see, while you were already thinking 3 steps ahead of him. Under the table, without looking at Archil, she moved her hand until her fingers found his wrist and pressed once, briefly, the way you press when you need someone to know you've understood without the room understanding it too. He didn't move, didn't react, but his pulse was there under her fingertips, and it told her everything that he'd felt it, that he was steady, that he was with her. She pulled her hand back. The dinner continued around them, voices and candlelight, and the careful theatre of a court rearranging itself after a death. And underneath all of it, something was already in motion that none of them could see yet. Something that had started long before either Tsisana or Archil were born, and that was now, after 3 generations of silence, beginning to move toward the surface. She could feel it. She suspected he could too. And she was beginning to understand that the only way through it was together, whether she had chosen that or not. She didn't sleep. She sat in her private chamber with the documents on the table in front of her and a single candle burning low, and went through everything she knew about Lord Sandro the way you go through a building after a fire methodically, looking for what started it. He had served her father for 30 years. He had been present at every major council decision she could remember. He had always been careful, always been measured, always positioned himself close enough to power to benefit from it, without being close enough to be blamed when things went wrong. That wasn't loyalty. That was survival dressed as loyalty. And she had been too young and too trusting to see the difference until now. She was still sitting there when Nino knocked just before dawn. Behind her was Archil. Tsisana looked at him in the doorway and then at Nino, who gave her the expression that meant she had made a judgment call and was prepared to defend it. Tsisana stepped back and let him in. He sat across the table from her without being invited, which she had already stopped finding irritating because it was simply how he moved through space, like he had considered the room and decided where he belonged in it. He looked at the documents, then at her face. "You didn't sleep either," she said. "No." He leaned forward with his forearms on the table. "I went through my father's records. The ones I brought with me, I keep them with my personal documents when I travel. I thought there might be something, a reference, a name, anything that connected." He paused. "I found one, a note my father wrote that I never understood. It says there is a debt the Eristavi line carries that cannot be repaid in gold or land. I always thought it referred to a financial arrangement. It doesn't." Tsisana looked at him steadily. "It refers to the throne." "Yes. Your father knew. My father knew. Which means he chose not to act on it. Which means either he was afraid or he was protecting something." He looked at her. Or someone. She turned that over slowly. A man who knew his bloodline had a legitimate claim to a throne and chose silence. That was either cowardice or something much more complicated. She thought about her own father, the man who had built alliances over a secret and sent for his enemy's son with his last breath. Both their fathers had carried this. Both of them had made choices around it that they never explained to their children. And now those children were sitting across a table from each other in the hours before dawn, trying to map the damage. "We need to move before Sandro does," she said. "Whatever he's passing north, it hasn't arrived yet. Riders take time, but we don't have many days." "I agree. But moving too fast draws its own attention. Then we move in the right direction, not just quickly." She stood and walked to the window. The city beyond the palace walls was still dark, just the earliest suggestion of grey at the edges of the sky. "There's a lord in the southern province, Georgian-inspired. He was my father's closest ally. Not politically, genuinely. He's the only council-adjacent person I trust without reservation. If we go to him first and give him enough of the truth, he becomes a wall between us and whatever Sandro is building. You want to ride south. In 2 days. Before the mourning period, protocols make it impossible to leave without explanation." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll come with you." She turned from the window. "I know." Something in his face shifted when she said that a small thing, barely visible, but she caught it. He hadn't expected her to say it that easily. She hadn't expected to either. 2 weeks ago, the idea of riding anywhere with Archil Eristavi would have felt like a sentence. Now it felt like the most logical thing in the room, which told her something about how quickly the world had rearranged itself around her. The 2 days passed the way days pass when you're waiting for something too slowly in the living and too quickly when you looked back at them. She met with council members and managed the mourning protocols and kept her face composed through all of it. Archil did the same on his side, visible enough to seem settled, careful enough not to provoke. They spoke twice in those 2 days, briefly and practically, and both times she noticed the same thing she always noticed now that the space between them had changed. It had a different quality than it used to, less like the gap between opponents and more like the charged air before a storm, full of something neither of them had named. They left on the third morning with a small party, 4 of her guards, 3 of his men, Nino, and a cover story about a provincial courtesy visit in her father's memory. It wasn't a lie, exactly. It just wasn't the whole truth. They rode for most of the first day without much conversation. The road south moved through open farmland, and then into forested hills where the trees were still bare from winter, their branches crossing over the road like a ceiling with gaps in it. The cold was steady and clean, and Tsisana rode without a hood because she needed the air on her face. She was aware of Archil riding beside her, with the same measured quiet he carried everywhere, and for a long time neither of them spoke, and it wasn't uncomfortable, which was the thing she was still adjusting to. The silence between them had stopped feeling like hostility. She didn't know exactly when that had happened. He spoke first, somewhere in the late afternoon when the forest thickened and the guards had drifted a few lengths back. "Tell me about your mother," he said. She glanced at him. "Why?" "Because you wear her bracelet every day. Because your father barely mentioned her in any of the council records I've read. And because everything I don't know about you feels relevant right now." She was quiet for a moment. The trees moved overhead. "She died when I was 7. Fever that took her in 3 days. I remember the speed of it more than anything, how she was present, and then she wasn't." She paused. "My father never spoke about her after, not once. I think he loved her in the way that breaks something in a person permanently, and he decided it was easier to build a wall around it. You think he was right to do that? I think it made him a worse father and a better king, and I think he would have made the same choice again." Archil didn't respond immediately. "Then, my mother left when I was 11. Not death, choice. She went to her family's estate and stayed there. My father said it was health. Everyone knew it wasn't." He looked at the road ahead. "I spent a long time trying to understand what kind of man makes the person he married want to leave that completely. I think I've spent most of my adult life trying to be the opposite of whatever he was." She looked at him. It was the most personal thing he'd said since they met, and it sat between them differently than politics did, warmer and heavier at the same time. She thought about the man she had built in her imagination from stories and resentments and second-hand accounts, and she looked at the man riding beside her, and the distance between those two things was large enough to be uncomfortable. "You're not what I expected," she said. "Neither are you," he said, and the way he said it made it clear he didn't mean it as a diplomatic courtesy. He meant it plainly and completely. They stopped for the night at a small estate belonging to one of the roadside lords, who gave them rooms and a meal, and asked no difficult questions because he was wise enough to understand that a princess in mourning, travelling with armed men, was not something you interrogated. Tsisana sat at the small table in her room after dinner with the documents and her thoughts, and the awareness that she was further from the palace than she'd been in months, and that the distance felt like breathing. Nino came in to help her prepare for sleep, and then paused at the door on her way out. "He sat outside in the corridor for an hour tonight," she said. "His men are quartered downstairs. He chose the corridor." Tsisana didn't look up from the table. "I know." "You know?" He heard something he didn't like in the way the estate lord spoke to his staff at dinner. "He's cautious." She paused. "Go to sleep, Nino." Nino looked at her with the expression she used when she had opinions she'd decided not to voice, and left. Tsisana sat for a long moment. Then she got up, crossed the room, and opened the door. Archil was sitting against the wall of the corridor with his legs stretched out in front of him and his head tilted back slightly. He looked up without surprise. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. She leaned against the door frame and looked down at him, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. The specific sensation of wanting to trust someone and being frightened of it in equal measure. "Archil," she said, "if we get to Amalakvari and this plan doesn't hold, if Sandro moves faster than we think, and the Northern Lords already have enough to act on, what do you do?" He looked at her with the full weight of his attention. I stand with you, he said. That's not strategy, that's just the answer. She held his gaze for a long moment. The corridor was cold, and the candle on the wall behind him was burning low, and they were a long way from the palace and all its performances. This was just two people in a quiet hallway with a complicated inheritance and the beginning of something neither of them had planned. Get some sleep, she said quietly. We ride early. She went back inside. She didn't close the door all the way, and in the morning when she opened it fully, he was still there. They reached Georgi-inspired's estate by midday. It sat at the edge of the southern hills, like something that had grown there naturally, wide stone walls, old trees pressing close on three sides, the kind of place that had survived long enough to stop trying to impress anyone. A steward met them at the gate and led them through a courtyard where hounds watched without barking, which Tsisana took as a good sign. Quiet dogs in a southern estate meant a lord who kept order without fear. Amilakvari himself met them in the main hall. He was older than Tsisana, remembered broader in the shoulders, slower in the walk, with a beard gone mostly grey and eyes that were still sharp enough to cut. He had known her father since before she was born. He looked at her, the way people look at someone they're grieving while standing in front of them, like the loss, and the person had become briefly confused. Then he looked at Archil, and his expression shifted into something more careful. Princess, he said, I heard about your father 3 days ago. I've been intending to ride north. You won't need to, she said. I came to you. He nodded slowly, reading the shape of the visit already. Then let's sit somewhere private. They sat in a back room lined with old maps and older books, just the three of them and Nino standing near the door. Tsisana laid the documents on the table and let him read. He took longer than Archil had. He read the way a man reads, when he needs to be absolutely certain, going back twice over specific sections, holding each page close to the light from the window. When he finished, he set them down with the careful deliberateness of someone handling something that could shatter. How long have you had these? He asked. 5 days, Tsisana said. We believe Lord Sandro has been sending information north. We don't know exactly what he knows, but enough to act on. We came to you first because we need a voice the northern lords will respect when this lands in front of them. Amilakvari looked at Archil. And you understand what these documents mean for your house? I understand completely, Archil said. And you're not moving to act on the claim? No. Amilakvari was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, a bird called once and went silent. Your father would have acted on it, he said to Archil. Not immediately, not clumsily, but he would have moved eventually. I know, Archil said. I'm not my father. Something in Amilakvari's face settled. Not trust yet, but the beginning of the consideration that comes before trust. He turned to Tsisana. What do you need from me? I need you to ride north within 2 days and arrive before whatever Sandro has sent. I need you to frame this as a consolidation of power, not a crisis. The union between our houses is already in progress. The southern province stands behind it. You are coming to confirm stability, not to manage emergency. She paused. And I need you to find out exactly what Sandro has told them and who is already listening. He looked at her for a long moment. You sound like your father, he said, the part of your father that was worth keeping. She took that without flinching, which was the only way to take it. He agreed. He sent a rider immediately to prepare his own northern contacts, and he gave them rooms for the night, and over an evening meal that was simple and warm, and nothing like the performance dinners of the palace. He talked to them both the way adults talk when ceremony has been set aside, and what remains is just the weight of real things. He told Tsisana things about her father. She hadn't known small things, human things, the kind of details that make a person more complicated and more real at the same time. She listened to all of it and felt the particular sadness of learning someone better after they were gone. She noticed that Archil listened too. He asked careful questions. He was respectful without being deferential, and Amilakvari responded to it the way experienced men respond to intelligence that doesn't announce itself loudly. It was late when they finally rose from the table. Amilakvari stopped Tsisana at the door, with a hand briefly on her arm. "He's not what I expected either," he said quietly. "I want you to know I say that as a man who expected very little." She smiled. "I know. Be careful with the next few days. Not just politically." He looked at her steadily. "Be careful with yourself." She nodded and went upstairs. She was standing at the window of her room looking out at the dark southern hills when she heard movement in the courtyard below. She looked down. Archil was there, standing alone near the old well at the centre of the yard, his back to the building, looking out at the tree line. She watched him for a moment without deciding to. There was something about the line of his shoulders, not tense, but carrying, like a man holding something he'd gotten accustomed to the weight of, and no longer noticed putting down. She went downstairs. The courtyard was cold and still, and her footsteps on the stones were quiet. He heard her anyway. He turned before she reached him, which she had come to expect. He noticed things. He always noticed. She stopped beside him and looked where he'd been looking, the dark edge of the trees, the hills beyond, the sky above them heavy with clouds that hadn't yet decided what they were carrying. "I've been thinking about what Amilakvari said," she began. "Which part?" "That your father would have used the claim eventually." She looked at him. "I believe it's true, and I've been trying to understand what it means that you won't, whether it's principle or strategy." He was quiet for a moment. "Does it matter?" "To me, it does." He turned to face her. They were close in the small courtyard, close enough that she could see the details of his face clearly even in the low light, the line of his jaw, the steadiness of his eyes, the particular quality of attention he gave her that she had never once received from someone who was supposed to be her enemy. "It's not strategy," he said. "I grew up watching what a man becomes when he builds everything on a claim he has to protect with force. My father was never at peace. Not one day in his life that I witnessed was the man at peace. He was always managing, always defending, always calculating the distance between himself and the thing that could take it all away." He paused. "I don't want that life. I never wanted it. I want something that holds because it was built right, not because I frightened everyone around me into not touching it." She looked at him, and something she had been holding tightly for days loosened. Not all of it, not enough to be dangerous, but enough to be honest. "I owe you something," she said. "You don't." "I do. I built a version of you in my head, from stories and grievances and things my father said, and I carried it for years like it was a fact. Everything you've done since you arrived here has contradicted it, and I kept looking for the version I expected, and it isn't there." She held his gaze. "I'm sorry for that." He looked at her for a long moment. "I did the same," he said. "Your house, your name, I had a story too. It wasn't kind." "What changed it?" "You," he said. "The garden. The way you held your hands in the throne room while the council talked around you. The way you read those documents and didn't fall apart. You just started solving." He paused. "The way you left the door open." The words landed somewhere deep and quiet, and she felt the full weight of them and didn't step back from it. She didn't step forward either. Not yet. But the space between them had been changing shape for days, and she was aware of it now, with a clarity that was almost painful, how small it was, how different it felt from the distance between enemies, how much it asked of her to stand in it and not name what was building inside it. "Archil," she said. "I know," he said, as if she'd finished the sentence. She almost laughed. She didn't. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the night pressed close around them, and neither of them moved, and it was Nino's voice from the upper window, quiet and regretful, that broke it. "They're here." Tsisana turned. 3 riders were coming up the road toward the estate at speed. Even in the dark, She could see the colours, Northern House colours, the pale silver that belonged to Lord Vano Baramidze, who was the most powerful of the Northern lords, and the most dangerous because he was the most patient. He had ridden through the night, which meant he hadn't waited for Sandro's word to arrive. He had already known. He had been waiting for a reason to move, and someone had given it to him days ago. Tsisana felt everything in her go cold and sharp at the same time. This was not the conversation she had been preparing for at Amilakvari's table. This was a confrontation arriving early, and she was standing in a courtyard in travelling clothes with a plan that had been designed for another 2 days of preparation. She felt Archil step up beside her. Not in front of her, beside her. "Whatever he says," she said quietly, "let me start it." "I know," he said. The riders came through the gate. The man who dismounted first was not Baramidze himself, but his eldest son, Luka, young, broad, and wearing the particular expression of someone who had been handed an important task and was determined not to ruin it. He looked at Tsisana, then at Archil, then at Tsisana again, and she could see him recalibrating against whatever version of this scene he had imagined on the road. She didn't give him the silence to settle into. "Luka Baramidze," she said, and her voice was warm and entirely controlled. "Your father sends you a long way on a cold night. Whatever he's heard, I'd like him to hear the rest of it from me before anything is decided. You'll stay the night. In the morning we'll talk, and you'll ride home with the truth, instead of half of it." She looked at him steadily. "Can you give me that?" He looked at her. He looked at Archil. He was young, but he was not foolish, and what she was offering him was a way to do his father's work without starting a war in a southern courtyard in the dark, which any reasonable man would take. "I can give you the morning," he said. "That's all I'm asking," she said. She turned and walked back inside. Archil walked beside her. Their arms nearly touched on the narrow stairs, and neither of them moved to create distance, and that itself was its own kind of answer to everything they hadn't said in the courtyard. Whatever was coming in the morning would be the hardest thing yet. She knew that. She could feel the shape of it already, heavy and inevitable, requiring things from her she hadn't fully prepared. But for the first time since her father died, she didn't feel like she was facing it alone. And that, she was beginning to understand, changed everything. She didn't sleep again. She sat at the small desk in her room and worked through every possible version of the morning conversation until she had worn them all down to their bones. Luka Baramidze was not the problem. Luka was young and capable, and had his father's intelligence without yet having his father's ruthlessness, which meant he could still be reached with honesty if the honesty arrived before his instructions did. The problem was what his father already knew and how much of it he believed, and who else in the northern houses had received the same information. Sandro had not been careless. Sandro had been moving quietly for years, which meant whatever he had sent north was packaged well, credible, specific, and designed to land in exactly the place that would cause the most damage. She was still sitting there when dawn came grey and cold through the window, and she heard a knock at her door that was too light to be Nino and too deliberate to be a servant. She opened it. Archil stood in the corridor with 2 cups of something warm and the look of a man who had also not slept and had stopped pretending otherwise. She stepped back and let him in. He set 1 cup on the table in front of her and stood near the window with the other, looking out at the pale morning light, the way people look at things when they need somewhere neutral to rest their eyes. "I've been thinking about Luka," he said. "So have I. His father sent him instead of coming himself. That's deliberate. Baramidze doesn't go to meetings he isn't certain of controlling. He sent his son because if this goes wrong he wants distance from it, but if it goes right he wants the credit." He paused. "Which means Luka has been sent here with a specific outcome in mind, but with enough flexibility to negotiate around the edges." Tsisana wrapped both hands around the cup. It was warm, and the warmth helped. What outcome does Baramidze want? Power without exposure. He doesn't want a war. Wars are expensive and unpredictable, and he's too careful for that. He wants leverage. He wants to be in the room where the decision gets made, and to have put himself there in a way that looks like loyalty instead of calculation. So we give him the room, she said. Archil looked at her. We bring him in, she said. Not Sandro's version of this, not a half-truth, not a managed message. We give Luca the actual documents, and we tell him his father can be part of the solution, or he can spend the next decade being managed around. And we frame it as an invitation, not a threat, because Baramidze responds to being valued and bristles at being cornered. You're asking him to keep a secret that could make him the most powerful lord in the north if he told it instead. I'm asking him to keep a secret that, if he tells it, starts a succession crisis that burns down half the kingdom and takes his house's prosperity with it. She looked at Archil. Men like Baramidze are careful because they've done the mathematics of every situation and they know what they can actually afford. He can't afford chaos. He can afford alliance. Archil was quiet for a moment. Then he said, When did you learn to think this way? I grew up in a palace full of people who wanted things from me, and a father who taught me how to read every room I walked into. She looked at the window. I watched him outmaneuver people my whole childhood, and I thought I was just watching. It turns out I was learning. He looked at her with the particular expression she had come to recognize over these past days, the one that meant he was seeing something and not trying to look away from it. He prepared you for exactly this, he said. He prepared me for a version of this, she said. He didn't prepare me for you. The words came out before she had finished deciding to say them, and she felt them land in the room and didn't try to retrieve them. Archil set his cup down slowly. He crossed the room and stood close enough that she could see everything in his face, which was no longer the guarded blankness of the throne room, or even the careful honesty of the garden. It was open in a way that cost him something, and he was offering it anyway. Tsisana, he said, just her name. The way it sounded in his voice was different from how anyone else had said it her entire life. She looked at him and understood with absolute clarity that everything she had been telling herself about maintaining distance and keeping this practical and not allowing personal feeling to compromise the situation was falling apart, quietly, and had been for days, and the only dishonest thing left would be to pretend otherwise. This is the worst possible timing, she said. I know. We have a northern lord in the next room, and a council crisis 3 days behind us, and a secret that could destroy both our houses. I know all of that, he said. And I'm standing here anyway. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached up and pressed her hand flat against his chest, not pulling him closer, just resting it there, feeling the weight of him, the solidity, the realness of a person who had stopped being an enemy somewhere along the road and become something she didn't have a clean word for yet. He covered her hand with his. He didn't move. He just held it there and looked at her, and she understood that this was him giving her the choice entirely, making no move that she hadn't first permitted, which was so different from what she had expected of him that it made something ache. After the morning, she said quietly. After Luca. After we've handled what needs handling. After, he agreed. She pulled her hand back. He let her. They stood in the early morning with 2 feet of space between them, and the full weight of everything still ahead, and it was enough for now. It was more than enough. It was the first promise they had made each other that had nothing to do with survival. The morning came fully, and breakfast was laid in Amilakvari's main hall, and Luca Baramidze came to the table, looking like a young man who had lain awake reviewing his instructions, and was now sitting with the particular stiffness, someone who hasn't decided yet whether to be formal or flexible. Tsisana gave him no opening for formality. She sat down across from him and began immediately, not with the documents, but with the truth, in plain language, what the documents contained, what it meant for both houses, what Sandro had done, and what she and Archil were building instead. She spoke for a long time without interruption, and Luca listened with his hands flat on the table and his eyes moving between her and Archil and back again, tracking everything. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. My father believed the Eristavi claim would destabilize the entire central region if it became public, he said. He believed it needed to be managed from the north before the palace had the chance to manage it first. Your father was right that it needs managing, Tsisana said. He was wrong about who should manage it. Luca looked at her directly. He won't stand behind a union he wasn't consulted on. He's being consulted now, she said, through you. Which is why your father sent you, because he knew if there was a version of this he could stand behind, you'd find it. Something shifted in Luca's face. He was young, but he was not being underestimated, and he knew it, and that mattered to him. He looked at Archil. You're choosing her house over the claim your blood carries. I want to hear you say it. Archil met his eyes without hesitation. I'm choosing stability over destruction. I'm choosing to build something that lasts over a war that won't. He paused. And yes, I'm choosing her house. Tell your father that directly. Tell him that clearly. Lucas sat with that for a long moment. Then he pulled a slow breath and nodded, once. The way people nod when they've made a decision they know is the right one, and are accepting the responsibility of it. I'll speak to my father, he said. I can't promise his agreement, but I can promise his silence until he hears from me. That gives you time. That's all I need, Tsisana said. He rode out within the hour. Amilakvari watched him go from the gate and then turned to Tsisana with something that was the closest thing to approval she had ever seen on his careful face. Your father would have taken 3 days to reach that same result and spent twice the political currency doing it, he said. You did it over breakfast. She smiled briefly. I had help. Amilakvari looked at Archil. Yes, he said. I see that. They prepared to ride north before midday. Tsisana stood in the courtyard while the horses were being brought around, looking at the hills and the road ahead and the weight of what still waited at the palace. Sandro, the council, the formal ceremony that was now less than 3 weeks away, and the specific kind of tension that lives in a situation when the worst of it has been briefly managed but not yet resolved. Archil came to stand beside her. Their shoulders were nearly touching. Neither of them moved to close it or create distance, just stood in it the way you stand in something that has stopped needing explanation. When we get back, he said, Sandro will move quickly. He'll know Luca came south. He'll know we got here first. Yes. Oh, he'll try something before the ceremony. He'll want to break the union before it becomes official and too large to challenge. I know. She looked at the road ahead. Let him try. She felt Archil look at her sideways, and she felt the warmth of it even without seeing it. You have something planned, he said. I have something started, she said. I'll have it fully planned by the time we reach the palace. Tell me on the road. Parts of it, she said. The rest you'll have to trust me on. He was quiet for a moment. Then, all right. She turned and looked at him, and the morning light was full and clear and honest, and she saw him clearly in it. Not the enemy her childhood had built, not the stranger who had arrived at her gate, not the careful ally of the past difficult days, but the person who had stood beside her when it mattered, and chosen her when he didn't have to, and held her hand gently against his chest in a cold room before dawn. Archil, she said. Yes. Thank you. She said it simply. And she meant all of it, the corridor, the courtyard, the morning, every moment of steadiness he had offered her since this began. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her since the night before, open and without defence. Don't thank me yet, he said quietly. We still have to get home. The horses were ready. Nino was already mounted and looking at Tsisana with the expression that meant she had observed everything and would be saying nothing and would be carrying all of it privately for the rest of her life. The guards formed up. The road stretched north through the hills, and the pale winter light lay across it like something waiting. Tsisana mounted and turned her horse toward the road and felt the weight of everything ahead, the palace, the council, the confrontation with Sandro that was coming whether she wanted it or not, the ceremony that would change both their lives permanently, and the feeling of something still unfinished between her and the man now riding beside her, something that the morning had moved closer to but not yet reached. 30 days had begun as a sentence. She was no longer sure what they were becoming, but for the first time since her father's hand had closed around her wrist in a dying room, she was riding toward it instead of being pushed. And that was the difference between a cage and a choice. They rode through the night for the last stretch and reached the palace before dawn on the second day, which was what Tsisana had wanted. Arriving in darkness meant arriving before the court was assembled, before the day's performances had begun, before Sandro had the chance to arrange his version of events in front of an audience. She had learned from her father that the person who sets the room before everyone else arrives is almost always the person who controls what happens in it. The palace gates opened for her without question. She was still the princess. She was still the authority in this house until a formal ceremony said otherwise, and even then she intended to remain the authority in a way that ceremonies couldn't fully contain. She rode through the courtyard with Archil beside her and gave quiet instructions to her guards before dismounting 2 men to the council archive to secure her father's remaining private documents, 2 to watch the north-facing servants' gate through which Sandro's riders had been moving, and Nino to find out exactly where Lord Sandro was and what he had been doing in the 4 days they had been gone. Nino came back within the hour. She found Tsisana in the private chamber, still in her riding clothes, standing over a table where she had laid out everything she knew in the order she knew it. "He moved faster than we thought," Nino said. "He called an informal council gathering yesterday evening. Not a formal session, he doesn't have the authority to call one of those without you. But he gathered enough of the lesser lords and 2 of the senior council members in the East Hall, and he told them that the union between your house and Eristavi was built on a fabricated agreement, that Archil's presence here was strategic rather than ceremonial, and that the stability of the throne required a formal review of the succession before any marriage could proceed." Tsisana was quiet for a moment. Which 2 senior members? Lord Tamaz and Lord Irakli. She turned that over. Tamaz was old and easily frightened, and went with whoever seemed most settled. Irakli was more dangerous, sharp, ambitious, and had been passed over for the head council position twice in the last decade, which meant he carried the specific resentment of a capable man who believed the world owed him more than it had paid. Where is Sandro now? Waiting for the morning session. He intends to raise the review formally in front of the full council. Tsisana nodded. Then we let him. Nino looked at her carefully. He's built his position in private, Tsisana said. He's been careful and quiet, and he thinks he's arriving at the formal session with enough support to make the request impossible to deny. We let him make his move publicly because that is where we want this resolved, in front of everyone, with no room for later revision. She went to find Archil. He was in the corridor outside, which no longer surprised her, and when she told him what Sandro had done and what she intended, he listened without interrupting, and then asked 2 precise questions about the council composition that told her he had been thinking about this contingency for days. They stood in the corridor and worked through it together in low voices, and the ease of it, the way they moved through the problem without friction, finishing each other's reasoning without competition, settled something in her that she didn't have the time to examine yet, but registered deeply. The morning council session was called for the 2nd hour after dawn. Tsisana arrived first. She sat in the chair at the head of the table that had been her father's, and felt it differently than she had the first time, not as a weight pressing down, but as something she was choosing to hold. The council filed in. She watched Sandro enter and find her already seated, and see Archil take the chair to her right, and she watched the specific moment when Sandro understood that she had come back early, and the calculation behind his eyes shifted. He recovered quickly. She gave him that. He composed his face into appropriate solemnity and took his seat. And when Lord Daviti formally opened the session, Sandro rose within the first minutes with the measured energy of a man who believed he was delivering clarity to a confused situation. He spoke well. He always spoke well. He framed the informal gathering as a concerned response to uncertainty, positioned himself as a servant of the kingdom's stability rather than a challenger of Tsisana's authority, and proposed the succession review with enough procedural language to make it sound like a natural and reasonable step. He avoided specifics about the documents. He was too careful for that. He spoke only in implications, in questions of legitimacy and timing, in the language of caution, and Tsisana sat and listened to all of it and let him finish completely. Then she stood. She didn't look at Sandro. She looked at the full council at Tamaz, who was already uncertain, and Irakli, who was watching carefully, and Lord Daviti, who wanted nothing more than for this to resolve cleanly, and the dozen other men around the table who had served her father and were now trying to determine who deserved that same service. Lord Sandro has raised the question of legitimacy, she said. I want to thank him for doing it in this room, rather than continuing to do it in private gatherings he called without my knowledge or authority. She paused, and let the silence carry what she hadn't said aloud, that she knew, that she had known, that nothing in her palace moved without her understanding it eventually. Sandro's composure held, but his eyes shifted slightly. That was enough. There is no question of legitimacy, she continued. The union between House Matsketa and House Eristavi was my father's final act of governance, and it is being honoured not because of obligation, but because both parties have chosen it freely and fully understand what its problem means. She turned to Archil, and he stood without being prompted, which was exactly what they had arranged, and the fact that it happened without visible coordination was the point. Archil looked at the council with the same steadiness he carried everywhere, the quality that made rooms quiet without requiring volume. I came to this palace as an ally, he said. I remain here as one. Whatever questions exist about the history between our houses, they are being answered by both of us together in full knowledge of that history. He paused. If there are members of this council who believe they can manage this kingdom's stability more effectively through disruption than through unity, I'd ask them to calculate that more carefully. It wasn't a threat. It was something colder and more effective than a threat. It was an invitation to consider consequences, delivered by a man whose house controlled enough of the Eastern military structure to make the consequences real. Irakli sat back slowly. Tamaz looked at his hands. Sandro rose again. He was committed now and had no clean way to retreat. The question of the founding documents, he began, has been reviewed, Tsisana said, and she placed a folded document on the table, not the original, which was secured elsewhere, but a formal summary prepared with Amalakvari's endorsement and Luca Baramidze's acknowledgement of having seen the material and found it consistent with the union proceeding. By myself, by Lord Archil, by Lord Amalakvari of the southern province, and with the awareness of House Baramidze in the north. If Lord Sandro has further questions about the documents, he is welcome to direct them to any of those parties. She paused. Or he can explain to this council who he has been sending riders to in the northern district and why. The room went very still. Sandro looked at her, and she looked back, and there was a long moment where two people understood each other completely, what he had tried, how far he had gotten, and exactly where he now stood. He was not ruined. She hadn't set out to ruin him, because a ruined man with nothing left to protect was more dangerous than a contained one. But he was finished as a force of opposition. The room had seen it, and rooms remembered. He sat down. Lord Daviti cleared his throat with the relief of a man watching a storm pass. The council notes the union between House Matsketa and House Eristavi proceeds as arranged. The ceremony will take place in 18 days as scheduled. He looked around the table. Is there further business? There was not. The session ended. Council members rose and filed out in the way people file out when they have processed something significant and need space to arrange their thoughts about it. Tsisana remained seated until the room was nearly empty. When she finally stood, Archil was still beside her. "Sandro," she said quietly. "He'll pull back," Archil said. "He has no remaining position from which to move, and he knows it. For now," she gathered the papers in front of her, "we'll need to watch him for months." "I know. We will." The word was natural and unthinking, and she felt it land in her chest in the specific way that small, ordinary words land when they carry more weight than the person saying them realized. She looked at him. He met her eyes, and she could see he'd heard it too. The we, the ease of it, the way it had come out of him, without strategy or performance. The council room was empty now, the long table cleared of everyone except the two of them, and the morning light was coming in full through the high windows and laying itself across the stone floor in long, pale lines. It was a room she had sat in her entire life, and it looked different now. Everything looked different now. "Archil," she said. "Yes." She put the papers down. She turned to face him fully and stood in it, in everything that had happened since the morning her father had died, in the distance they had crossed, in the enemy she had expected, and the person who had shown up instead. "I made a decision on the road," she said. "I didn't tell you all of it." He waited. "After the ceremony, after everything is settled and official, and the council has accepted the new shape of things." She looked at him steadily. "I want to go back to that courtyard. Not the one at Amalakvari's, this one, the one with the broken fountain, where none of this started, but where some of it changed." He looked at her for a moment. "What happens there?" "Nothing formal," she said. "No council, no performance, just us. And the conversation we've been not quite finishing since the garden." Something moved across his face that was quieter and more certain than anything she had seen there before. Not the careful control of the throne room or the guarded honesty of their early conversations. Something settled. Something that had made peace with itself. "All right," he said. She nodded once and picked her papers back up and walked toward the door, and he fell into step beside her the way he had fallen into step beside her on the stairs at Amalakvari's estate, neither of them closing the last distance, but both of them moving in the same direction without discussion. The 18 days passed, the way days pass when they are full of necessary things, preparations and protocols, and the slow, careful work of building trust with lords who had been uncertain, of managing Sandro's retreat into something that looked like dignified withdrawal, of making the union visible to the court in ways that read as genuine because they were becoming genuine. Quietly and without announcement, she and Archil ate together most evenings. They walked the palace corridors in the late hours when the court had gone to sleep, and the building was just stone and shadow and their own voices. She told him things she hadn't told anyone, and he received them without trying to fix them, which was the thing she had needed without knowing she needed it. He told her things about his childhood and his father, and the specific loneliness of growing up carrying a name with complicated history, and she understood more of him each time until the understanding felt like something she had been building for years rather than weeks. The ceremony came on a grey morning, and it was formal and correct, and everything a court required, and she stood beside him in the great hall, and said the words that joined their houses, and felt the difference between performing something and choosing it, which was all the difference there was. Afterward, when the hall had emptied, and the court had moved on to the celebration in the outer rooms, she found him standing near the window at the far end of the hall, looking out at the city the way he looked at things when he was thinking rather than watching. She stood beside him. "You promised me the courtyard," she said. He looked at her. Then he held out his hand. She took it. They walked through the quiet end of the palace and out through the low wooden door and into the courtyard, with the cracked fountain and the bare winter trees and the cold morning air that pressed close and clean. The noise of the celebration was distant and muffled, and it was just them and the sound of their own breathing, and the silence that had stopped feeling empty a long time ago. She turned to face him, and he was already looking at her with everything open, nothing managed, no room between his face and what he felt. And she understood finally that this was what it looked like when Archil Eristavi was not protecting himself. This was what he looked like when he had decided to stop. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, and he closed his eyes briefly and then opened them and looked at her. And she saw everything, the weight he had been carrying, the choice he had made, the person he was trying to be and was succeeding at being, and her own reflection somewhere in all of it. "I was so certain I would hate you," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "I was wrong." "I know that too." She kissed him. It was unhurried and certain, and full of everything the past weeks had built between them, the tension and the trust and the grief and the fighting and the long road south and the corridor outside her door and every small moment in which two people who were supposed to be enemies had chosen something else instead. He held her with the same quality of steadiness he had always carried, like someone who understood that the things worth holding required patience, and she leaned into it and let herself be held and felt the specific relief of a person who has been strong through everything and is finally, in one moment, allowed to simply be. The city moved beyond the palace walls. The court celebrated in the rooms behind them. The kingdom continued its complicated business of existing, and in the small courtyard, with the broken fountain, in the cold and the quiet, something that had started in enmity and moved through grief and danger and distance, arrived finally at the place it had been moving toward all along. Not the end of a story, the beginning of one. Now, before you go, drop your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. If this story moved something in you, hit that subscribe button. You clearly feel stories deeply, and there are many more waiting for you right here.